Hi, Dane Ryan, and today on Green Christendom, we're going to be doing some fermenting. Going to make some sauerkraut and a Mexican pineapple fermented drink called tepache. G.K. Chesterton, commenting on the common modern contention that you can't turn back the clock, pointed out that this is a bad metaphor because you in fact can turn back the clock. All you have to do is put your finger to one of the hands and turn it back. And in fact, you should do that whenever the clock is off. So you can in fact turn back the clock. I'm thinking about that. Whenever there is something that is off, a lot of times we'll be able to figure out what we could do better by looking back and seeing if we've ever done something better. The environmental crisis in which we find ourselves, I'm not just talking about global warming or whatever, but all the problems that we have with earth, air, and water because of a lot of our present practices comes from stuff we've adopted since the Industrial Revolution to a large degree. So, people tend to point towards technological and industrial solutions to these problems, and maybe some of those could help, but looking for the solution in that which caused the problem itself is a little bit of a strange proposition. So maybe we could find some of the solutions by going back to the ways we used to do things. Not everything, and a lot of these things will need to be adapted to something more efficient than how our ancestors did it in the past. But some of the ancient techniques that they used are for certain essential human purposes much better for human beings. And we have in fact turned back the clock in this kind of way over the last few decades. For instance, in my grandparents' generation, breastfeeding was not that common. Counseled using formula, both for convenience and because they said it was better for the baby. And now we know that breastfeeding is 100 times better for the baby. And it fulfills all kinds of nutritional needs and immunological needs and all kinds of things that we're probably never going to be able to find a sufficient way to imitate in formula. And also the bonding between the mother and the infant in the act of nursing provides for certain pretty essential psychological needs. So people have, to a large degree, returned to the practice of nursing whenever possible. People also used to like TV dinners for their convenience. These things have become less prevalent, both partially because of the plastic. We've come to want to go back to home cooking, which was once seen as a domestic drudgery for housewives. So, in various ways, we have figured out that some of the stuff that our ancestors were doing fulfilled human needs better. And we have turned back the clock, at least partially, in those manners. What we're going to be talking about today is another way in which people have been turning back the clock. One of the ways that ancient peoples preserved their food was by putting them in a saltwater solution or a sugary solution and letting them ferment. That is, letting bacteria go to work on them and preserve them and change their taste and their nutritional profile. In fact, we might be evolutionarily adapted to fermented food. The bacteria that are in fermentation, lactobacillus especially, are some of the bacteria we also have in our guts that help with our immune function and all kinds of other stuff, to help us digest our food, help us get vitamin B. And by consuming fermented food, we can help our microbiome in our guts. So here's a way in which a lot of people are turning back the clock. Even in my grandparents' generation, they did a whole lot more canning than they did fermenting. I had a couple great aunts that made cottage cheese and sauerkraut, I think. But for the most part, people in those days didn't ferment near as much because the canning also is becoming popular. And while I kind of prefer fermenting, it's a little simpler process. You just put it in salt water and let it sit and make sure that it stays beneath the salt water. Canning is also something that would be very good to bring back. By these kinds of methods, we can grow our own food and preserve the food when it's out of season so that we can have it at other times, or buy it in season and preserve it that way, like my grandma would do with peaches, with overripe peaches when they were cheap and good for canning. I think doing these kinds of things can also help us get back to being a bit closer to the natural world. We're actually creating a little tiny ecosystem with living beings, tiny little living beings that we can't see. And so we can have our little fermentation pet and think about that complex and amazing ecosystem. And that can't quite be imitated either. A lot of our store-bought ferments, they've just isolated a couple of bacteria and put them in there like buttermilk. It's not really the leavings of the process of turning butter anymore. It's a fermented milk product, but it's fermented with a couple of bacteria that they've isolated. And so if you use it multiple times, it might not stay stable because they only use a couple forms of bacteria. They don't get that living community with its symbiotic relationships that will endure over time, sometimes for centuries. So that, for instance, the sourdough cultures in San Francisco have endured since people came over from Europe. People 70, 100 years ago lived much closer to the natural world, much closer to the ways that their ancestors had been doing things back almost to the dawn of humanity. So they might well have understood, not just by reading about such things, but by actual living, about whenever the scripture talks about leaven, sourdough culture, basically. That makes, and the metaphors that Christ uses about the leaven of the Pharisees, or what unleavened bread is in comparison, and all those kinds of things. That is another fermentation process, by the way, involving both lactobacillus and yeasts. Maybe we'll make a sourdough culture sometime. I haven't been able to take care of them very well so far, and I've lost them all, but someday we'll maybe go on that journey together. And living closer to nature, you can be more aware of the needs of nature. You can be more aware of nature's irreducibility to matter and mechanism. Of, for instance, in this sourdough culture, the irreducibility of life. Louis Pasteur, Catholic scientist who discovered the world of microbes, thought that it really showed the irreducibility of all forms of life, that life didn't arise like Augustine thought it did from simply seminal forms and things, so that rotting bread caused maggots instead of vice versa. I think that's what he said, something along those lines. Also, the distinction between artifice and nature, between the forms that man imposes on things from the outside simply by construction, and the forms that God infuses into things so that it's a principle whereby it acts from within. Towards certain ends and consistent actions, and giving the thing a unity that's recognizable. And getting to know things in this kind of way, getting to know the glory of God in creation, is, I think, a first step towards actually establishing the kind of harmony with nature and with God's creation that we need in order to solve the crises we are facing. This moral and intellectual and religious internal conversion to seeing things differently, to approaching and acting differently in regards to things. This knowledge and this love in our heart, soul, and spirit towards things as God created them, we need to cultivate. And so, one way to cultivate this may be to return to some of these primal and elemental things our ancestors did, like fermenting food. And it'll also help your health and well-being. If you do it right and don't get some crazy mold and then eat it and poison yourself. But that's pretty easy to avoid. Saying it's pretty easy to avoid, I am not giving health advice. All right, let's get started. Okay, so we're going to measure these first, weigh them. Okay. £3 basically. Two, so about 5. That will give us what we need for salt and water portions. Not going to, you should be able to find some measurements on some other YouTube videos. I'm not going to be too technical. I will put below a video that I go on for salt amounts. Make sure to use a salt that doesn't have additives, that is either pure salt or like a sea salt. Don't use iodized salt. Don't use salt with anti-caking agents, especially. Those will make the water cloudy. They might have cyanide compounds in them. I'm going to save some of these outer leaves to press down the brine, because in order to get the lactobacillus going and to keep stuff you don't want, aerobic stuff, out, you want to make sure that it is not exposed to oxygen. Going to go fairly loosely on the weight. If the salt varies a little bit on this application, it's probably not going to be too bad. You could have more, you could have less. Sauerkraut is pretty hard to do wrong. So long as you do things basically right. But try to go by basically what you find recommended. Especially on more sensitive fermenting projects, you might want to go by weight rather than volume. On this, this will be salt that we're not going to add any water to it. We are going to draw the water out by putting it with I try to get it fairly thin, depending on what texture you want it to be, is how thin you might want to cut it. Careful with your knife. I have also got a mandolin that I should try using sometime. I got for this, but have not got it out of the box yet. Such a simple process. These cabbages are not from my garden, but someday, when I have a bigger garden and farm, this will be one of the ways that I'll preserve produce. Alright. So, compost your scraps if you can. And add some salt. I'm going to use canning salt. Like I say, get some measurements according to I am just going to mix this up real quick. And let it sit to draw out some water. And then we're going to work this down. All right, let's get started. We're going to press and squeeze and such in order to draw out the natural juices of the cabbage. Your hands aren't soapy or anything, because remember, we are trying to breed bacteria. There's natural bacteria. Also, make sure that when you wash this, wash it with some filtered water or water from a well or something, rather than water full of chlorine. For the next part, we'll actually have to use water. So we'll also have to have some water. So you can get a lot of water coming out of this. And I have to draw out enough that we can just use this water to ferment it in. If we need to, we can top it off with a little bit of non-chlorinated water. I left some water out in a pitcher for the tepache. And squeeze and twist. Of course, whatever texture you get this into is going to be the texture that you have basically in your final product. So if you want it solider, and don't squeeze it as much, maybe, or for as long. If you want it more mushy, squeeze it more. Don't know if mushy is the right word. If it's weirdly mushy, then it's probably not bad. Squeeze really well. Gonna need plenty of liquid. So we're going to put it in a glass container, and we're going to press it down, get it all beneath the brine. Now I'm going to put a couple of these leaves on top. To try and get this liquid down. Okay, I'm going to put a plate in here. Now, to weigh this down. I would have had a bag as well. This will have to do. All right. Found that the bigger container didn't work as well. And I found this container worked just as well. In fact, my wife says that, pointed out, it works out better because squaring the space pushes the water up, putting it in a more confined space. And I put a couple of my big cabbage leaves over here so I could press it down, so all of it is beneath the liquids. I will put it in a warm spot and we will let it sit for a few days. I will give you updates. If it turns out well. If it starts bubbling in a few days and starts smelling nice and sour, not rotten, but nice and sour, then that's a sign that this process is working. And so we move on now to the tepache. All right, now we're going to make the tepache with this pineapple. It's a Mexican fermented drink. Okay, I have rinsed it off with some water that I let set out. Let it set out overnight, and that should be enough time to get rid of the chlorine. I have also a water filter pitcher. I haven't got it set up yet, but I will use that for future fermentation projects. So let's get this top cut off. If it were a nice one, might try putting it in a pot, but it's kind of wilted down. You could just use the skin and the hard part in the center of the pineapple scraps for your tepache. So way not to waste them. Today I'm going to use the whole pineapple. cut it into small pieces. Have this jar. Make sure that it's food safe. I believe this jar is. All right. Now we'll pour the water. Again, I left this open overnight to Again, I left this out so that the chlorine would evaporate, that it would not affect my ferment. I'm going to put in a few allspice berries. Some cloves. Some ground cinnamon. I would put in some sticks if I have them. Maybe I do, hiding somewhere in the cupboard, but couldn't find any. Bit of ground ginger. And some chili flakes. Okay. Addition, going to be adding a bit of brown sugar for more so that the yeast and bacteria will have more stuff to feed on, and it'll also, like the salt, prevent the growth of the bad stuff. Again, for amounts, see, yeah, there are some other YouTube videos. Might post one or two of those down at the description. In the description. Just kind of guesstimating this up to incorporate it all. Make sure that the sugar gets dissolved pretty well. Mix it. We want to lay down these fruit so that they are all below the water line. So I'm just going to use something like this. Let's see. Okay, so I have improvised a weight for the tepache. I have a plastic container, and inside the plastic container I have a cup with some tap water in it. It is in a plastic bag because it is not dechlorinated water. So the water level is over the pineapple chunks. If the pineapple chunks were above the water, they would get mold on them, and this whole thing would be messed up. So make sure to keep your fruit or vegetable chunks in your ferments below the water surface. They have actual weights for this. I should get some. But for now, this is what I'll do. Okay. And here we have the ferments. We will watch their progress. So, fermenting. A way to be more self-sufficient. To get closer to nature. To the way our ancestors lived. And to build a green Christendom. All right. Have a good day, everybody. God bless.